"Dad, Dad, is that you? Please help me. They're going to kill me." The desperate female voice on Michael Davenport's private phone line froze him mid-stride across his penthouse office, 90 stories above Manhattan. His brain struggled to process what he'd just heard, not the panic in the stranger's voice, not the obvious terror, but that single word, Dad. In 53 years, no one had ever called him that. No one could. Michael Davenport, CEO of Davenport Industries, with a net worth of $11 billion, had no children. He had no family at all. His life was the epitome of success without legacy. The corner office with its commanding view of the skyline, dotted with buildings bearing his company's logo, the mansion in the Hamptons, the private jet, the fleet of luxury cars, and absolutely no one to share it with or leave it to. The voice on the line had to be wrong, a mistake, or worse, a trap. Yet something about it kept him from immediately hanging up. "Who is this?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as his security team silently entered the room, alerted by the distress sensors monitoring his vital signs. The sobbing on the other end of the line continued. "My name is Alexandra Mitchell. My mother is Jennifer Mitchell. She said you're my father, and I never wanted to contact you, believe me. But they've taken me, and they're demanding $30 million by tomorrow night. Mum couldn't get it. She didn't know what else to do." The intercom buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. "Mr. Davenport, the board is waiting in the conference room," his executive assistant's voice announced. Michael checked his Patek Philippe watch. 7 minutes past 6. He was rarely late, but today something had made him linger at the window longer than usual. Perhaps it was the date, May 17th. He usually managed to power through this day without acknowledging its significance, but this year the date felt heavier somehow. 26 years ago today, Jennifer Mitchell had walked out of his life for good. He had been nobody then, just a scholarship student with big dreams and an even bigger chip on his shoulder. Now he was Michael Davenport, and she was, well, he had no idea what had become of her. He had made it a point never to look her up, not even once in all these years. Some doors were meant to stay closed. "Tell them I'll be there in 2 minutes," he replied, straightening his custom Tom Ford tie. The board meeting would drag on for hours, dissecting the proposed acquisition of their main competitor, Peterson Tech. It was a $3 billion deal, the kind that would make headlines and solidify Davenport Industries' dominance in the tech sector for the next decade. Michael had personally orchestrated every aspect of the takeover, identifying Peterson's weaknesses, exploiting their recent setbacks, and positioning his company to swoop in when their stock price hit its lowest point. It was what he did best, calculated moves on a chessboard where most people couldn't even see past their next pawn. The boardroom fell silent as he entered, 12 faces turning to him with that peculiar mix of fear and respect he had grown accustomed to. Among them was his CFO, Robert Jenkins, the closest thing Michael had to a friend, though neither would ever use that term. They had met at Harvard Business School and had been working together since Michael founded the company with nothing but a business plan and stubborn determination. "Let's not waste time," Michael said, as he took his seat at the head of the gleaming mahogany table. "Peterson's board is meeting tomorrow morning. By noon I want a signed letter of intent on my desk." 2 hours into the meeting, as the legal team was detailing the antitrust concerns they might face, Michael's private cell phone vibrated in his pocket. He ignored it. Only 5 people had this number, and they all knew better than to call during board meetings unless it was truly urgent. But then it vibrated again and again. On the fourth consecutive call, Michael excused himself with a curt nod and stepped into his adjoining private office. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, no caller ID, just a string of digits he didn't recognize. Normally, he would have ignored it and had his security team trace it later, but something, perhaps the persistence of the caller or the strange mood that had followed him all day, made him answer. "Davenport," he said sharply. For a moment, there was nothing but silence on the other end, followed by what sounded like muffled crying. He was about to hang up when a young woman's voice came through, shaky and desperate. "Dad? Dad, is that you?" The word hit him like a physical blow. He had been called many things in his life. Boss, Mr. Davenport, sir, even bastard by those he'd crushed on his way to the top. But never, not once, had anyone called him Dad. "You have the wrong number," he replied coldly, despite the sudden tightness in his chest. But the voice continued, more urgent now. "Please don't hang up. Your name is Michael Davenport. You met my mother, Jennifer Mitchell, at Harvard. I know you don't know about me, but I need your help. They're going to kill me." The name, Jennifer Mitchell, froze him in place. His mind raced through possibilities. A scam. It had to be. Some elaborate extortion attempt. But how would they know about Jennifer? He had never spoken her name to anyone, not in all these years. Their relationship had ended before his rise to prominence, before anyone would have had reason to dig into his past. And yet here was this voice claiming to be impossible. "Who is this?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I'm Alexandra," the voice replied, a catch in her throat. "Alexandra Mitchell. I'm 25 years old, and according to my mother, you're my father. I never wanted to contact you, believe me, but they've taken me, and they're demanding $30 million by tomorrow night, or they'll kill me. Mom couldn't get it. She didn't know what else to do." Michael's mind, trained through decades of high-stakes negotiations to detect lies, searched for the falsehood in her words, but found none. 25 years! The math added up perfectly to that last month with Jennifer, to those final weeks before she'd told him his ambition would be his only lifelong companion, and walked away. "Where are you?" he asked, his voice betraying nothing of the earthquake happening inside him. "I don't know exactly," Alexandra answered, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Some kind of warehouse. I managed to get one of their phones when they weren't looking. Please, I know this is crazy and you have no reason to believe me or help me, but—" A commotion on her end, sounds of a struggle. "They're coming back. Please help me. 30 million by tomorrow night, or they'll—" The line went dead. Michael stood motionless, the phone still pressed to his ear. The boardroom next door continued its murmur of strategic discussions and financial projections, but it seemed to exist in another dimension now. A daughter. He might have a daughter who was in danger. In the space of a 3-minute phone call, the world he had so carefully constructed over 3 decades had been fundamentally altered. He could walk back into that meeting, dismiss the call as a bizarre prank, and continue with the acquisition that would cap his legendary career. Or he could acknowledge the possibility that the life he never knew he had created was now hanging in the balance. For a man who prided himself on split-second decision-making, this choice took him a surprising 5 full minutes of standing alone in his office, wrestling with a past he had buried and a future he had never imagined. Robert looked up in surprise when Michael re-entered the boardroom. "We need to postpone the Peterson acquisition," Michael announced without preamble. A collective gasp went around the table. "Push the letter of intent to next week. Something urgent has come up." Before anyone could question him, something no one at Davenport Industries had dared to do in years, he was already calling his head of security. "Get the jet ready," he instructed. "And I need your best people to trace a call that just came to my private line. Yes, now. This takes priority over everything else." As he gathered his things, he caught Robert's concerned gaze. "I might have a daughter," he said simply, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "And she might be in trouble." Robert, to his credit, didn't ask a single question. He just nodded and said, "Whatever you need." In that moment, Michael was reminded of why he had kept the man close all these years. The familiar hum of the private jet's engines usually lulled Michael into a productive state of mind, but as they flew toward Boston, the last known location of Jennifer Mitchell, according to his security team's hastily assembled report, his thoughts were anything but focused. He stared at the dossier his team had put together in the 2 hours since the call. Jennifer Mitchell, Ph.D., professor of art history at Boston University, never married. One daughter, Alexandra Mitchell, born January 15th, 25 years ago. He studied the photos his team had pulled from social media and university websites. Jennifer was still beautiful, her chestnut hair now streaked with silver, her smile a bit more reserved than he remembered, but still capable of reaching her eyes in certain photos. And then there was Alexandra, a striking young woman with her mother's delicate features but with eyes that were unmistakably Davenport eyes. His eyes, the same shape, the same unusual shade of green that he saw in the mirror every morning. He had looked at enough evidence to convince any reasonable person, yet he still found himself calculating the odds that this was all an elaborate con. The jet landed at a private airfield outside Boston just after midnight. A car was waiting to take him to Jennifer's address in Cambridge. His security detail had advised against going there directly. "If this is a kidnapping, sir, the family's residence could be under surveillance." But Michael had dismissed their concerns. He needed to see Jennifer face to face. He needed to hear from her own lips whether Alexandra was truly his daughter before he transferred $30 million to unknown kidnappers. The suburban street was quiet when the car pulled up to the modest colonial house with its well-tended garden. Lights still burned in several windows despite the late hour. Michael instructed his security team to wait in the car and approached the front door alone, his heart hammering with an unfamiliar anxiety. He had imagined this moment many times over the years, not the circumstances, but seeing Jennifer again. In his mind he had always been cool, perhaps slightly condescending, letting her see exactly what she had walked away from. But standing on her porch at midnight, with their possible daughter's life in danger, all such petty thoughts evaporated. He rang the doorbell and waited, adjusting his tie in a nervous gesture he hadn't made since his 20s. The door opened, and there she was. The years had been kind to Jennifer Mitchell, softening rather than hardening her. She wore reading glasses now, and her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked like someone who had lived a satisfied life, though tonight her face was drawn with worry. Her eyes widened in recognition, then quickly filled with a complex emotion Michael couldn't quite name. "Michael," she said, his name almost a sigh on her lips. "You came." She stepped back, opening the door wider. "You actually came." The interior of Jennifer's home was exactly as Michael might have imagined if he had ever allowed himself to wonder about her life. Bookshelves lined the walls, art hung everywhere, not expensive pieces but thoughtfully chosen ones, and the furniture looked comfortable rather than impressive. It was the home of an academic, a thinker, someone who valued substance over appearance, all the things she had accused him of not appreciating in their final argument all those years ago. "Is it true?" he asked without preamble, still standing in her entryway. "Is Alexandra my daughter?" Jennifer nodded slowly, her composure remarkable given the circumstances. "Yes," she said simply, "she's yours. I found out I was pregnant after we broke up. I considered telling you, but you were already so focused on your future. You made it very clear that nothing would stand in your way." There was no accusation in her tone, just a statement of fact. "I made a choice to raise her on my own. She's known about you her whole life, but she respected my decision not to disrupt yours." Michael absorbed this information like a physical blow. A quarter-century of a life he knew nothing about. A daughter who had grown up without him, not because he had abandoned her, but because he never knew she existed. "Tell me about her," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Jennifer gestured toward the living room, and they sat across from each other. She on the worn leather sofa, he perched uncomfortably on an armchair that was clearly designed for relaxation rather than the rigid posture he maintained. "She's brilliant," Jennifer began, a mother's pride momentarily eclipsing her fear. "Graduated summa cum laude from MIT in computer science. She works for a cybersecurity firm now. She's stubborn like you, driven, but she also knows how to balance her life better than either of us did at her age." She paused, brushing away a tear. "At least she was balancing it until this happened. Tell me everything you know about the kidnapping," Michael said, switching to the pragmatic mode that had served him well in countless crises. Jennifer explained that Alexandra had disappeared 3 days ago after leaving work. There had been no word until yesterday, when Jennifer received a video call showing Alexandra bound to a chair, along with demands for $30 million. They knew exactly who to ask for, Jennifer said, her academic composure finally cracking. They knew who her father was. They kept saying the daughter of Michael Davenport was worth at least $30 million. Michael's jaw tightened. If the kidnappers knew Alexandra was his daughter, that meant someone else had known, someone who had kept this information and waited for the right moment to use it. "Did she contact me with their phone?" he asked. Jennifer nodded. "They called me again this morning. They let her speak to me briefly. She said she would try to get to a phone and call you directly. I gave her your number." She looked away. "I've had it for years. I almost called you so many times when she was growing up. When she won the science fair in 5th grade. When she graduated high school at 16. When she got into MIT. Each missed milestone hit Michael like an indictment. A life he should have been part of. Moments he would never get back. But there was no time for regrets now. "I have a team tracing the call she made to me," he told Jennifer. "And I've already initiated the money transfer to my offshore account for the ransom. But I'm not just going to hand it over and hope they release her. My security team includes former Special Forces operatives. Once we locate her, they'll extract her." Jennifer looked at him with the same searching gaze he remembered from their college days, the one that always made him feel like she could see straight through his carefully constructed facades. "You believe she's yours just like that? No DNA test? No proof beyond my word and a phone call from a stranger?" Michael met her gaze steadily. "I saw her photo," he said simply. "She has my eyes, exactly my eyes. But beyond that, I don't know how to explain it, Jennifer. When she called me Dad, something responded. Something I didn't even know was there." The night passed in a blur of activity. Michael set up a temporary command center in Jennifer's dining room with secure laptops, satellite phones, and a rotating shift of security personnel reporting on their progress. Jennifer watched with a mixture of awe and wariness as Michael Davenport, Billionaire CEO, took control of the situation with the same efficiency that had built his empire. "You really haven't changed, have you?" she observed during a rare, quiet moment when they were alone in the kitchen. Michael looked up from his coffee cup, surprised by the comment. "Meaning?" Jennifer leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You're still the most competent person in any room, still convinced you can bend the world to your will through sheer force of determination." There was no malice in her observation, perhaps even a hint of reluctant admiration. "It served me well," he replied, neither proud nor apologetic. Jennifer's expression softened. "Yes, it has. I used to think I was right to walk away from what we had, that your ambition would hollow you out, leave nothing but achievement without joy. Looking at you now, I'm not so sure anymore." Before Michael could respond, his security chief entered the kitchen. "Sir, we've triangulated the call location based on cell tower data. It's a warehouse district in South Boston. Satellite imagery shows several potential buildings, but we've narrowed it down to 2 most likely locations." Michael was on his feet immediately. "Prepare the team for extraction. I'll be going with you." This statement met with immediate objections from both his security chief and Jennifer, but Michael silenced them with a look that had cowed far more formidable opponents. "She called me Dad. She asked for my help specifically. I'm not sitting in a safe location while others take the risk." He turned to Jennifer. "I've missed 25 years of her life because I didn't know she existed. I'm not missing this." Jennifer looked as though she wanted to argue further, but instead she nodded slowly. "Just bring her home," she said, her voice catching. "Bring our daughter home." The warehouse district loomed dark and industrial against the pre-dawn sky. Michael, dressed now in black tactical gear that felt utterly foreign against his skin, sat in the lead SUV as his security team's convoy approached the location. The plan was straightforward. 2 teams would simultaneously breach the 2 potential locations where Alexandra might be held. Michael would remain with the command unit until a location was confirmed, then join the retrieval once the scene was secure. That was the plan his security chief had explained in precise, non-negotiable terms. Michael had nodded his agreement, with no intention of actually complying if it meant waiting while others rescued his daughter. The convoy stopped several blocks from the target sites, engines idling as final preparations were made. Through his earpiece, Michael listened to the team leader's final checks. In moments they would move. The first location, a defunct paper processing plant, was quickly cleared. "Negative on package," came the terse report through the comm system. All attention shifted to the second location, an abandoned shipping warehouse near the water. Michael felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest as he waited for news. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals with less anxiety than he felt in this moment. "Movement detected east side of the structure," reported a surveillance team member. 3, possibly 4 individuals, armed. Michael's security chief put a restraining hand on his arm, as though sensing his employer's growing impulse to move closer. "Let the team do their job, sir." Michael shrugged off the hand, but remained seated, his eyes fixed on the warehouse barely visible in the distance. The next few minutes passed in a blur of tactical communications, positions confirmed, entry points identified, teams in place. Then, with a simple execute command, the operation was in motion. The sound of flashbang grenades and the brief stutter of gunfire came through both the comm system and the night air. Michael was out of the SUV before his security chief could stop him, moving toward the warehouse with a single-minded focus that brooked no interference. He was halfway there when the report came through. "Package secured. Repeat, package secured. 3 hostiles neutralized, 1 in custody. Medical assessment underway." Michael broke into a run, ignoring the protests of his security detail. He reached the warehouse just as the tactical team was emerging, surrounding a slight figure supported between 2 operatives. Even in the dim light, Michael could see that it was her, Alexandra, walking under her own power despite looking exhausted and bruised. He stopped short, suddenly uncertain. What right did he have to rush forward, to claim paternal concern for a young woman he was meeting for the first time? But then Alexandra looked up and saw him. For a long moment they simply stared at each other, the billionaire CEO and the daughter he never knew he had, recognizing in each other's eyes a mirror of their own. Then Alexandra straightened slightly, disengaging from her supporters, and took a shaky step toward him. "You came," she said, echoing her mother's words from hours earlier. "You actually came." Michael nodded, unable to find words adequate to the moment. "Your mother said the same thing," he finally managed. A ghost of a smile crossed Alexandra's battered face. "We Mitchell women are observant that way." Then, with the suddenness that caught Michael entirely off guard, she closed the distance between them and put her arms around him. It was an awkward embrace. His tactical gear, her weakened state, and 25 years of absence between them. But it was real. After a moment's hesitation, Michael returned the embrace, careful of her injuries but holding her securely nonetheless. "I've got you," he said softly. "You're safe now." The return to Jennifer's house was a blur of medical assessments, police statements, and security debriefings. Alexandra had been beaten but not severely injured. The kidnappers had been careful to keep their valuable hostage in relatively good condition while awaiting ransom. She was currently upstairs, resting under sedation after being examined by a private physician Michael had flown in. The lead kidnapper, now in police custody, had already confirmed what Michael had suspected. Someone had discovered Alexandra's connection to him and orchestrated the kidnapping specifically to target his wealth. The investigation into who had leaked or discovered this information was ongoing, but Michael had his suspicions. The timing, days before the Peterson acquisition, seemed too convenient to be coincidental. Dawn was breaking as Michael sat alone in Jennifer's kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee gone cold. He had been awake for nearly 30 hours, but sleep was the furthest thing from his mind. Jennifer appeared in the doorway, looking equally exhausted but somehow more at peace than earlier. "She's sleeping," she reported, pouring herself a cup from the pot Michael had brewed hours ago. "The doctor says she'll make a full recovery." She sat across from him at the small kitchen table, studying his face. "What happens now, Michael?" It was the question he had been asking himself since the moment he'd heard Alexandra's voice on the phone. What did happen now? Did he simply write a check to cover her medical expenses, wish them well, and return to his life as if this extraordinary day had never happened? Did he attempt to forge a relationship with a fully grown daughter who had managed perfectly well without him for 25 years? Did he try to rekindle something with the only woman who had ever walked away from him? "I don't know," he admitted, the words unfamiliar on his tongue. Michael Davenport always knew. It was his brand, his reputation, the cornerstone of his success. But here, in this kitchen, with his newly discovered family sleeping upstairs, he was adrift without a chart. "I've missed everything," he continued, a rare note of vulnerability in his voice. Her first steps, her graduation, everything that makes her who she is. "I can't get that back." Jennifer reached across the table, hesitating for a moment before placing her hand over his. "No, you can't," she agreed, her tone gentle but unflinching. "But she's 25, Michael. She has decades ahead of her. Decades where you could be part of her life if that's what you both want." Michael looked down at their hands, hers small and marked with the faint ink stains of an academic, his larger and manicured to corporate perfection. "And what about you?" he asked, meeting her eyes. "Is there a place for me in your life after all this time?" Jennifer withdrew her hand slowly, her expression thoughtful. "I don't know," she echoed his earlier response. "We're different people now. You're Michael Davenport." She gestured vaguely, encompassing his empire, his reputation, his life so far removed from her quiet academic existence. "And I'm still just a professor who spends too much time with dead artists and not enough with living people, according to my daughter." A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "But I think we owe it to Alexandra to find out if there's still something worth exploring between us." Michael felt something shift inside him, not the familiar tectonic movement of a business victory, but something smaller and yet somehow more significant. A door opening where he had long ago accepted there was only a wall. "I have a board meeting on Friday," he said, thinking aloud. "The Peterson acquisition is scheduled to close next week. There are quarterly projections due, and the London office needs—" He trailed off, realizing how hollow these commitments suddenly sounded in Jennifer's kitchen, with their injured daughter sleeping upstairs. Jennifer watched him, her expression unreadable. "The Empire calls," she observed, neither judging nor approving. It was a statement of fact, an acknowledgment of the reality that had separated them 26 years ago. Michael was silent for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in slow circles. "The Empire," he finally said, "has survived without me for exactly 1 day. I suspect it can manage a few more." He looked up, meeting Jennifer's surprised gaze. "I'd like to be here when Alexandra wakes up. I'd like to hear about those science fairs and graduations I missed, if that's okay with both of you." Jennifer's smile was like the breaking of dawn, gradual, warm, illuminating. "I think," she said carefully, "that would be the beginning of something important." Hours later, as afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows of Jennifer's comfortable living room, Michael sat across from Alexandra, both of them awkwardly holding cups of tea neither was drinking. She looked better after rest, the bruises on her face still vivid but her eyes clear and alert, studying him with an intensity that reminded him forcefully of looking in a mirror. "So," she finally said, breaking the silence, "this is weird, right? It's not just me?" The directness startled a laugh out of Michael, a genuine laugh, not the calculated chuckle he deployed in boardrooms. "Definitely not just you," he agreed. "I was preparing for a hostile takeover yesterday morning. Now I'm sitting here with a daughter I didn't know existed until you called me Dad on the phone." Alexandra winced slightly. "Yeah, sorry about the dramatic introduction. I had this whole plan about maybe reaching out to you someday in a very mature, non-crisis way. Hello, Mr. Davenport. You may be interested to know you contributed genetic material to my existence." She shrugged, then grimaced at the movement. Getting kidnapped kind of accelerated the timeline. Her dark humor, her resilience in the face of trauma, Michael recognized these as coping mechanisms he himself employed. Nature or nurture? It was impossible to say. "I'm glad you called," he said simply, "and not just because it meant we could find you." Alexandra studied him for a long moment, her expression guarded. "Mom always said you were completely focused on your future," she finally said. "That you wouldn't have wanted the complication of a child?" It wasn't quite a question, but the unspoken, "Is that true?" hung in the air between them. Michael considered deflecting, offering some sanitized version of his younger self that would be more palatable to this young woman whose good opinions suddenly mattered so much. But she deserved the truth, however uncomfortable. "Your mother was probably right," he admitted. The Michael Davenport of 26 years ago was single-minded. Building something that would last, that would matter, was all I thought about. If she had told me about you then— He shook his head. "I'd like to believe I would have done the right thing, but I don't know if I would have been capable of being the father you deserved." Alexandra nodded slowly, absorbing this honesty without visible judgment. "And now?" she asked, her direct gaze so much like his own it was almost disconcerting. "Now that you know about me, what do you want?" It was the most straightforward question anyone had asked him in years. In his world of corporate maneuvering and strategic alliances, true intentions were rarely stated so plainly. "I want," he began, then stopped, realizing he hadn't actually formulated a clear answer to this most essential question. What did he want? To make up for lost time? Impossible. To forge a relationship with a stranger who happened to share his DNA? Complicated at best. To find some measure of redemption for a life built on achievement rather than connection? Perhaps too self-serving to be worthy of this remarkable young woman. "I want the chance to know you," he finally said, setting aside his untouched tea. "Not to replace the life you've had, or to pretend the last 25 years didn't happen, but to be part of your life going forward, if you'll let me, in whatever capacity makes sense to you." Alexandra's expression softened slightly, some of the wariness leaving her eyes. "I did some research on you," she admitted. "Well, a lot of research, actually. Before all this happened. Cybersecurity is my field, so—" She shrugged again, more carefully this time. "You've built something impressive. 65,000 employees worldwide. Technology that's changing how people live. Charitable foundations that actually do real work instead of just being tax shelters." She paused, her next words clearly chosen with care. "But from everything I could find, you're also completely alone. No family, no long-term relationships, just the empire." There was no accusation in her tone, only observation, but Michael felt the truth of it like a physical pressure in his chest. "The thing about empires," he said after a moment, "is that they only seem worth it when you don't realize what you're giving up to build them." He met her gaze directly. "I would trade a significant percentage of mine to have known you were calling me Dad long before yesterday." Alexandra's eyes widened slightly at this admission. "That's a pretty significant statement from someone with your net worth," she said, a hint of her earlier dark humor returning. Then, more seriously, "I don't need your money, you know. I have a good job, a life I've built. What I've never had is a father." She hesitated, vulnerability briefly visible beneath her composed exterior. "I'm not sure I even know how that works at this point." Michael considered this, then offered, "I'm not sure I know how to be one, but I'm willing to learn if you are." For the first time since he'd arrived, Alexandra smiled. A small, tentative thing, but genuine. "I guess we could figure it out together," she suggested, "starting with maybe a dinner that doesn't involve kidnapping or ransoms or tactical extraction teams. Just talking, getting to know each other." Michael felt something expand in his chest, something long dormant, flickering back to life. "I'd like that," he said simply. Then, with a glance toward the kitchen where Jennifer was giving them privacy, "And your mother? Would she join us?" Alexandra's smile widened knowingly. "I think she might be persuaded," she said. "She kept a file of news articles about you, you know. Every major deal, every profile piece. She said it was to show me where I came from, but—" She let the implication hang in the air. The conversation continued as afternoon stretched into evening, awkward at times, profound at others, gradually easing into something that felt, if not familiar, then at least possible. When Jennifer joined them, bringing a simple dinner she'd prepared, the three of them sat together at her dining table, an improbable family unit formed through extraordinary circumstances. Looking at them, Jennifer with her quiet wisdom, Alexandra with her resilient spirit and familiar eyes, Michael felt something he had not experienced in decades, the sensation of having found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, like standing on the edge of an investment that could either bankrupt him or yield returns beyond calculation. 3 months later, Michael stood once again at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan office. But the view had changed. Not the skyline, that remained as impressive as ever, but his perception of it. The Peterson acquisition had been completed, though he had delegated much of the final negotiation to Robert, who had risen admirably to the challenge. Davenport Industries continued to thrive, though its CEO now kept different hours, flying to Boston every weekend and some weeknights, working remotely on Fridays from a newly purchased apartment in Cambridge. His executive team had adjusted to the change with varying degrees of surprise and adaptation. The business press had speculated wildly about his shifting priorities, some suggesting health concerns, others hinting at possible regulatory issues. None had discovered the truth, that Michael Davenport, the man Forbes had dubbed married to his empire, was slowly, cautiously building a relationship with the daughter he never knew, and reconnecting with the woman who had once known him before he became a billionaire. The intercom buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. "Mr. Davenport, your car is waiting," his assistant announced. And Ms. Mitchell called to confirm dinner reservations for 8 o'clock. Michael checked his watch, not the Patek Philippe, but a simple Timex that Alexandra had given him, with the wry comment that billionaires should occasionally remember how normal people tell time. It had been a small gesture, but significant, the first gift from daughter to father, marking a new chapter neither of them had anticipated. "Thank you," he replied to his assistant. "I'm heading down now." As he gathered his things, his phone buzzed with a text message from Alexandra. "Fair warning, Mom is bringing up the possibility of Thanksgiving together. Be prepared to discuss turkey preferences. This is not a drill." Michael smiled as he read the message, still marveling at how quickly she had mastered the art of teasing him, of treating him not as the intimidating billionaire CEO, but simply as the father who was trying, sometimes awkwardly but always sincerely, to be present in her life. Michael found himself spending more time in Boston than he ever would have imagined possible. The apartment in Cambridge had started as a practical solution, a place to stay during his increasingly frequent visits, but gradually transformed into something that felt remarkably like a home. It was nothing like his Manhattan penthouse or Hamptons estate, with their carefully curated interiors designed to impress rather than comfort. This place he had allowed Alexandra to help furnish, resulting in an eclectic mix of modern functionality and unexpected warmth. "For a tech billionaire," she had teased, "you have surprisingly old-fashioned taste." He had watched her arrange books on shelves, hang art on walls, and gradually infuse the space with personality it would never have possessed had he left it to his usual interior designers. The process had been a metaphor for what was happening in his life, Alexandra and Jennifer adding color and texture to an existence that had been efficient but monochrome. The relationship between father and daughter evolved with cautious but steady progress. There had been awkward moments, times when Michael's instinct to solve problems with money had clashed with Alexandra's fierce independence. "I don't need you to buy me a new car," she had snapped during one particularly tense exchange 3 weeks after her rescue. "I need you to understand that I've managed just fine without a billionaire father for 25 years, and I'm not suddenly helpless now that I have one." Michael had been stung by the rebuke, but recognized its validity. He was accustomed to expressing care through resources rather than presence, fixing rather than listening, learning to simply be a father, without the cushion of wealth as his primary tool, was the most challenging role he had ever undertaken. "I don't know how to do this," he had admitted one evening as they sat on the balcony of his Cambridge apartment, the Charles River gleaming below them. "I keep wanting to give you things because it's the only language of care I'm fluent in." Alexandra had smiled then, the resemblance to her mother striking. "Maybe we can be language partners," she had suggested. "You teach me corporate takeover strategy, I'll teach you how normal humans show affection." Their first breakthrough had come through work, ironically enough. Alexandra's expertise in cybersecurity had proven invaluable when Davenport Industries faced a sophisticated hacking attempt targeting their newest technology. Michael had invited her to consult on the company's response, not as a token gesture, but because her skills were genuinely needed. Watching her command a room full of his top tech executives, unintimidated by either their positions or her connection to the CEO, had filled Michael with a pride unlike anything he had experienced in his professional life. "She's extraordinary," he had told Jennifer over dinner that evening, the three of them celebrating Alexandra's successful strategy. "She gets her intelligence from her mother," Jennifer had replied with a smile, but Michael had shaken his head. "No, she gets her particular blend of intellect and stubbornness from both of us. Heaven help the world." The laughter they had shared in that moment had felt like the beginning of something precious, a family forged against all odds and decades too late, but genuine nonetheless. Jennifer proved the most complex piece of this unexpected puzzle. The attraction that had drawn them together in college had never truly disappeared, merely been buried beneath layers of time and separate lives. As summer turned to fall, they found themselves spending time together, even when Alexandra wasn't present. Dinners that stretched late into the evening, walks through Cambridge that had no destination beyond conversation, phone calls that began with practical matters concerning their daughter, but inevitably meandered into deeper waters. "We're not 20-somethings anymore," Jennifer had pointed out one evening as they sat on her porch, watching October paint the trees in her front yard with crimson and gold. "We've both built complete lives without each other." Michael had studied her profile in the fading light, struck by how time had refined rather than diminished her beauty. "Complete?" he had questioned softly. "I built an empire, Jennifer. You raised our remarkable daughter, but I'm not sure either of us would claim our lives were complete." Her silence had acknowledged the truth of his observation, and when her hand had found his in the gathering darkness, it had felt like both an ending and a beginning. Thanksgiving arrived with unexpected emotional weight, the first holiday where Michael found himself part of a family gathering rather than working through the day or attending some obligatory charity function. The invitation to join Jennifer and Alexandra at Jennifer's sister's home in Vermont had terrified him more than any high-stakes business negotiation ever had. "They're going to hate me," he had told Alexandra bluntly during their weekly coffee meeting at the small cafe she favored near her apartment. "I'm the man who didn't show up for 25 years. Alexandra had stirred her latte thoughtfully before responding. "First, you didn't know about me, so that's not fair. Second, yes, my Aunt Marie will probably give you the cold shoulder for at least the first hour. My cousins will ask inappropriately direct questions about your net worth. Uncle Steve will want to pitch you his terrible startup idea." Her green eyes, so eerily like his own, had fixed him with a steady gaze. "But they're good people who love me and Mom, and they'll make room for you because you matter to us now." The simple statement had left Michael uncharacteristically speechless, a lump forming in his throat that no board meeting had ever produced. The Vermont farmhouse had been chaotic, crowded, and utterly unlike anything in Michael's experience. 4 cousins, 2 aunts, an uncle, and Jennifer's 80-year-old father created a cacophony of conversation, laughter, and occasional heated debates that enveloped the house like a living entity. Michael, accustomed to environments where his presence commanded immediate deference, found himself wonderfully, terrifyingly irrelevant. No one cared about his Forbes ranking or his latest acquisition. Alexandra's cousin Emma wanted to know if he was good at card games. Jennifer's father, a retired history professor with a razor-sharp mind, engaged him in a spirited discussion about labor practices that left Michael feeling intellectually outmatched for the first time in decades. And Jennifer's sister Marie, after the predicted cold shoulder, had cornered him in the kitchen with a directness worthy of her niece. "You broke her heart once," she had stated without preamble. "Jennifer doesn't show it, but she feels things deeply, always has." Michael had nodded, accepting the implicit warning. "I was too ambitious to see what mattered then," he had replied honestly. "I'm not asking for your blessing, Marie. Just the chance to prove I've learned something in 26 years. His sincerity must have registered, because Marie's expression had softened slightly. "She kept every article about you, you know, every success, every award. She said it was for Alexandra, but—" She had left the implication hanging between them. "I know," Michael had replied quietly. "I never looked her up, not once, because I was afraid of what I'd still feel if I did." Dinner itself had been a revelation. The long table crowded with mismatched chairs, children and adults interspersed rather than segregated, conversation flowing like the wine that seemed in endless supply. Michael found himself seated between Alexandra and Jennifer's young nephew, a solemn 8-year-old who regarded him with undisguised curiosity. "Are you really a billionaire?" the child had asked, his voice carrying in one of those sudden lulls that seems to occur at large gatherings. The table had gone momentarily silent, the adults exchanging uncomfortable glances. But before Michael could formulate an appropriate response, Alexandra had leaned forward. "Yes, Tommy, but that's probably the least interesting thing about him. Did you know he can recite all the presidents backwards, and that he once built a computer from scratch when he was in college?" Neither statement was true, as Alexandra well knew, but the diversion worked. The conversation resumed its natural flow, and Alexandra had winked at her father, a small gesture of complicity that warmed him more than any business triumph ever had. Later, when dinner was finished and the family had scattered to various corners of the house, some watching football, others playing board games, the children engaged in an elaborate game of their own invention, Michael had found himself on the back porch with Jennifer, both of them seeking a moment of quiet amidst the happy chaos. "Thank you for including me today," he said, his breath visible in the cold November air. Jennifer had smiled, drawing her cardigan closer around her shoulders. "Alexandra wanted you here. So did I." The simplicity of the statement belied its significance. "I've been thinking about something you said months ago," Michael continued, turning to face her in the soft light spilling from the kitchen windows. about whether there's still something worth exploring between us. Jennifer's expression grew thoughtful, her eyes searching his. "And what conclusion have you reached, Mr. Davenport?" There was a teasing quality to her tone, but underneath lay a genuine question. Michael took a deliberate breath. "I've reached several conclusions, actually. First, that I've accomplished everything I set out to do professionally, and while I'm proud of that, it didn't bring the fulfillment I expected. Second, that watching our daughter navigate the world, even for these few months, has given me more genuine joy than the last decade of business success combined." He paused, gathering courage for the final and most important conclusion. "And third, that I never stopped loving you, Jennifer. I buried it, denied it, focused on building my empire instead, but it was always there. When Alexandra called me that night, when I saw you again, it was like finding a piece of myself I'd forgotten was missing." The vulnerability of the admission left him feeling exposed in a way no financial risk ever had. Jennifer was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the dim light. Then she stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and placed a hand against his cheek. 26 years is a long time, Michael," she said softly. "We're different people now." His heart constricted painfully, but then she continued, "But I think I'd like to get to know this version of you. The man who drops everything to save a daughter he didn't know he had. The man who endures my sister's interrogation and plays Monopoly with my nephews without complaint. The man who finally understands what matters." The back door opened suddenly, spilling light and noise onto the porch. Alexandra stood framed in the doorway, her expression shifting rapidly as she registered the intimate moment she had interrupted. "Sorry," she began, starting to retreat, but Jennifer reached out a hand to stop her. "No, come join us," she said warmly. "Your father and I were just discussing the future." Alexandra stepped onto the porch, her gaze moving between them with keen perception. "The future, huh?" she said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Anything I should know about?" Michael felt a momentary panic. They were still finding their footing as father and daughter. How would Alexandra feel about the possibility of her parents rekindling their relationship after all these years? But he needn't have worried. Alexandra looked at them both with a wisdom beyond her years. "You know," she said conversationally, "when I was a kid, I used to imagine my father showing up one day. In my fantasy, he was always some kind of hero who would sweep in and make our little family complete." She shrugged, her breath creating small clouds in the cold air. "I outgrew that fantasy, or thought I did. But watching you both these past few months," she trailed off, unexpectedly emotional. "I just want you to know I'm okay with whatever happens. More than okay." Michael felt his throat tighten with emotion he would have been incapable of expressing just months ago. Without conscious thought, he reached out, one arm wrapping around Jennifer's shoulders, the other extending toward Alexandra. After a moment's hesitation, she stepped into his embrace, and the three of them stood together on the porch of Jennifer's sister's farmhouse, connected by blood and choice and second chances. It was not a perfect resolution. There were still conversations to be had, boundaries to be established, old wounds that would require time and care to fully heal. But in that moment, Michael Davenport, who had spent decades calculating the value of everything he encountered, understood with perfect clarity that what he held now was beyond price. His empire still stood, still demanded his attention and expertise, but now it existed alongside something infinitely more valuable, something that had nothing to do with market share or profit margins, something that had begun with a desperate call from an unknown number and 3 words that had changed everything. "Dad, save me." As winter descended on the East Coast, bringing with it holiday decorations and end-of-year reflections, Michael found himself dividing his time between his corporate responsibilities and his newfound family, with increasing preference for the latter. The Peterson acquisition had been completed successfully, adding billions to Davenport Industries' valuation, but Michael had surprised his executive team by delegating much of the integration process to Robert. "Taking more personal time, sir?" his CFO had asked with uncharacteristic directness during their weekly meeting. Michael had considered how to respond. In the past, he would have deflected or changed the subject, maintaining the carefully cultivated image of the CEO whose only relationship was with his company. Instead, he had removed a small framed photograph from his desk drawer, Alexandra and Jennifer at the Vermont farmhouse, caught in a moment of laughter, and placed it prominently beside his computer. "My daughter and her mother," he had said simply. Robert's expression had shifted from surprise to understanding. "They're why you went to Boston that night," he had realized. "When you said you might have a daughter." Michael had nodded, words suddenly insufficient. Robert had studied the photograph thoughtfully before meeting his employer's gaze. "They look happy," he had observed. "So do you, Michael. I don't think I've ever seen that particular expression on your face before." It was true, Michael realized. The man captured in accidental profile at the edge of the photograph, looking at Jennifer and Alexandra with unguarded affection, was barely recognizable as the hard-driving CEO whose ambition had defined him for decades. Christmas approached with a new significance, the first Michael could remember anticipating with genuine excitement rather than obligation. He had invited Jennifer and Alexandra to spend the holiday at his Hamptons estate, promising them the full experience of what wealth could offer when directed toward creating joy rather than demonstrating status. Alexandra had finally agreed, on the condition that they maintain certain Mitchell family traditions, including what she described as embarrassingly cheesy matching pajamas and her mother's recipe for cinnamon rolls on Christmas morning. Jennifer had her own stipulation that they set aside time to volunteer at a local shelter, something she and Alexandra had done every Christmas since her daughter was old enough to help serve meals. Michael had readily agreed to both conditions, privately delighting in these glimpses into the family traditions he had missed. The holiday itself became a blend of old and new, Jennifer's homey traditions merging with the luxury Michael could provide. They had indeed worn matching pajamas. Alexandra had ordered a set in Michael's size with mischievous delight. They had served meals at a shelter in the Hamptons where Michael's unexpected presence had created a minor sensation until Alexandra had handed him an apron and stationed him at the dessert station, where his billionaire status quickly became irrelevant compared to his ability to serve pie efficiently. And on Christmas Eve, as they sat before the fire in his rarely used living room, Michael had given them each a small, wrapped package. "I know we agreed to exchange gifts tomorrow morning," he had said, uncharacteristically nervous, "but these are different." Alexandra had opened hers first, a simple velvet box containing a key. Her questioning look had prompted Michael's explanation. "It's to the house in Cambridge," he had said quietly. "The one 3 doors down from your mother's. I bought it last week. I'm keeping the apartment, but I thought someday this might be your home, if you want it." Alexandra had stared at the key for a long moment before meeting his gaze, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You're staying," she had said, not quite a question. Michael had nodded, his throat tight with emotion he was still learning to express. "I'm staying," he had confirmed. Jennifer had opened her package next, her steady hands betraying a slight tremor as she unwrapped a similarly small box. Inside lay not a key, but a delicate silver bracelet, and upon closer inspection she had realized it was the same one she had admired in a Cambridge boutique they had passed during one of their walks months ago. A handcrafted piece by a local artist, not valuable in terms of precious metals, but meaningful in its craftsmanship. "You remembered," she'd said softly. Michael had nodded, taking her hand in his. "I remember everything now, Jennifer. I spent too many years focused on the next acquisition, the next achievement, storing information only if it had strategic value. But I remember the name of the cafe where you told me you were applying to graduate school. I remember the book you were reading the first time I saw you in the university library. I remember how you take your coffee and why you prefer the paintings in the east wing of the museum to those in the west." He had paused, gathering courage for what came next. "And I remember promising you 26 years ago that one day I would build something that mattered. I thought I knew what that meant. I was wrong." From his pocket he had withdrawn a third small box, this one opened to reveal a ring, not ostentatious despite his wealth, but elegant in its simplicity, a deep blue sapphire instead of the traditional diamond. "I'm not asking for an answer now," he had said, meeting her widened eyes. "I'm asking for the chance to continue building something that actually matters, a life with you, with Alexandra, with whatever future we might create together." Jennifer had not taken the ring, but neither had she rejected it. Instead, she had closed his fingers gently around the box. "Keep this safe," she had said softly, "until we're both certain. We have time, Michael. We've waited 26 years. We can wait a little longer to be sure." He had nodded, understanding the wisdom in her caution. From the corner of his eye, he had caught Alexandra watching them, her expression a complex mixture of hope and protective concern. Later, when Jennifer had gone to bed, his daughter had joined him on the terrace despite the winter chill, both of them gazing at the dark Atlantic beyond the dunes. "You really love her," Alexandra had observed. Not a question, but a confirmation. Michael had nodded, no longer afraid to acknowledge the truth. "I never stopped," he had admitted. "I just buried it beneath ambition and pride, and the belief that success would be enough." Alexandra had been quiet for a moment before saying, "She deserves to be happy. So do you, for that matter." Her gaze, so eerily like his own, had fixed him with characteristic directness. "Just don't rush her, okay? Mom doesn't make decisions lightly, especially ones that affect her heart." As the new year dawned, bringing with it resolutions and fresh beginnings, Michael found himself dividing his time between New York and Cambridge, between the empire he had built and the life he was discovering. The board had reluctantly accepted his reduced schedule, recognizing that even a part-time Michael Davenport remained more effective than most full-time CEOs. Alexandra had taken a new position with a cybersecurity firm in Boston, politely declining Michael's offer of a role at Davenport Industries, with the explanation that nepotism is bad for both our reputations. Jennifer had returned to her teaching and research, but now their evenings and weekends often intertwined. Dinners together, quiet conversations that stretched late into the night, a cautious rekindling of what had begun so many years before. The ring remained in Michael's possession, a promise rather than a demand, waiting for the moment when both of them would be ready for that step. The story that had begun with a desperate call from an unknown number, "Dad, can you save me?" had transformed into something neither Michael nor Jennifer nor Alexandra could have predicted. A family forged in crisis but sustained by choice. A second chance at connections that transcended time and absence. And for Michael Davenport, the man who had built an empire on calculating the precise value of everything he encountered, the most profound lesson of his life, that the true measure of wealth had nothing to do with billions in the bank, and everything to do with the people who now called him father, partner, friend. As he stepped into the elevator that would take him down from his Manhattan penthouse office to the car waiting to drive him to the airport, to the flight that would carry him back to Cambridge, to the home where Jennifer and Alexandra would be waiting to hear about his week, he reflected that empires rise and fall, fortunes come and go, but some connections, once formed, become the true measure of a life's worth. And for a man who had spent decades knowing the price of everything, this lesson, learned late but learned deeply, was beyond value. If you found yourself moved by this story of unexpected connection and second chances, please consider subscribing to our channel for more thought-provoking stories that explore the depths of human experience. Your subscription helps us continue to share these meaningful narratives that remind us of what truly matters in life. When we share stories like Michael, Jennifer, and Alexandra's journey, we connect with the universal truths that bind us all together, that it's never too late to discover what truly matters, that families can be formed in the most unexpected ways, and that love, when genuine, can bridge even decades of separation. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to bringing you more stories that touch your heart and soul in our next video.